Welcome and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us for session 1 of our Juvenile Policy and Code Development Virtual Learning Series, hosted by the OJJDP Tribal Youth Resource Center. Today's session is entitled Beyond Transformative, Designing Your Tribal Juvenile Justice System/Laws, Big Picture Considerations. This is Laura Smith from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I serve as a program assistant with the Tribal Youth Resource Center team, and I'll be walking us through a few tech-related notes for today's online learning event. With that, I turn the time over to Tribal Youth Resource Center Assistant Director, Tasha Friday, who will be providing our opening.
Hello, everyone. As Laura said, my name is Tasha Friday. I am the Assistant Director of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, and just want to extend a warm welcome from the Tribal Youth Resource Center. We are a training and technical assistance provider for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and we work under the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and alongside our partners at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And so we really do seek to bring an in-depth understanding and appreciation for American Indian and Alaska Native history, customs, and Indigenous justice systems. And we are really guided in our work by a value that many of our Native people share, and that is our children are sacred. So to that end, we always like to open in a good way. And in so doing, we're going to start today with a quote. And so the quote is, "Children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future." And that sentiment was expressed by John F. Kennedy. But I think as Indigenous people who are very communal and we do see our children as sacred, that it really speaks to how we think of our children and why we do the work that we do and why it's important to explore how we can do it better. And I think that is what we're all seeking to do and learn here today. So really appreciate your presence and ask that you just keep that quote in mind. And then also maybe what is the traditional word for child or children in your native language or in the language of the communities that you serve, and keeping that close to our hearts and our spirits as we walk through this learning event today. Next slide, please. So it is our pleasure to have the Honorable Pat Sekaquaptewa here with us, and so appreciate your genius and your willingness to help with this and help all of the tribal nations and organizations that have come here today. So we really appreciate everything, your effort and your work and everything that you bring to the table. Next slide, please. My role here today is just to help facilitate. Pat and I will discuss some of the issues that arise and answer questions. So again, my pleasure to be here. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are a training and technical assistance here at the Tribal Youth Resource Center. Primarily, our work is under the CTAS areas Purpose 8 and Purpose 9. So that's Tribal Juvenile Healing to Wellness Courts and tribal youth programs. So that's the work that we do here. We are able to provide training and technical assistance to any federally recognized tribes. So if perhaps you aren't funded under one of these grant areas, but you would like training and technical assistance, you can go to our website, tribalyouth.org, and put in a request there. And there may be things that bubble up today in our session that would lead you to, reach out to us, and we're happy to help. Next slide. So for today, just a brief overview of what the session is going to be. So we're going to cover the development of juvenile justice system that defines and separates dependency and delinquency provisions, the different treatment of truancy, status offenses, juvenile offenses, and adult crimes, and then we'll address juvenile justice process that supports tribal youth. The format today is that you are going to watch a pre-recorded part of the session from Pat, and then we will go into some polling questions and some conversation. So with that being said, I think we can go ahead and go into the video.
This is session 1 of the Juvenile Policy and Code Development Virtual Learning Series. And in session 1, titled Beyond Transformative, Designing Your Tribal Juvenile Justice System and Laws, the Big Picture Considerations, we're going to look at some of the deficits in our tribal justice systems that we inherited, either in the laws and or the process. So I'm going to go ahead and skip forward to slide 6, given that we've probably already done introductions in person. Okay, so slide 6 should say Overview of Session 1. And in this session, we're going to cover specifically law provisions that tend to get lumped together and when and why we should split them out. Specifically, we want to distinguish provisions that address dependency, which is like child maltreatment, abuse, neglect, abandonment, things that focus on the parent's conduct. We want to split those provisions out from delinquency provisions that really focus on the conduct of youth. Also, there may be reasons to split out provisions that deal with truancy and provisions that deal with status offenses. These are things that young people might do that are not crimes or wouldn't be crimes if they were an adult, like violating curfew, for example. And there's a list of other status offenses that different tribes define. Also, we want to think about our juvenile justice systems in terms of how they support tribal youth. Okay, so one of the premises here is that there are things that our tribal legal structures do, our tribal juvenile justice systems do, that can actually have negative consequences. So for example, are we doing things either in our law or in our court process or related process that actually causes more truancy or status offenses, maybe causes juvenile delinquency or criminal conduct? Are we somehow facilitating or at least not hindering homelessness and suicide in our communities? So there's a loaded premise here, or possibility that our systems might be doing more harm than good, especially if we have not updated them. Okay, so I made a list of 6 kind of problem areas here, but before I go into them, I would like to tell you a story. I'd like to tell you a true story about a young woman named Brianna, who is right now, as we speak, caught up in the juvenile justice system in the state of Arizona. And if you'll allow me to here, I will just go over my notes a little bit so that you can get a sense of her experience, and we can use her story to think about what are the implications for how we should reform the tribal system. Okay, so Brianna is a member of the Cherokee Nation. She's also part Mexican American, and she was born in the town of Cottonwood, Arizona in 2001, so that means about now she would probably be 19 years old. The incident that gives rise to her incarceration happened in April of 2019. So the allegation is that she violently attacked a juvenile corrections officer in her detention facility, and specifically that she punched this woman repeatedly in the head like 30 times. Consequently, the prosecutor in Arizona is attempting to try her as an adult for 2 felonies. One count would be dangerous or deadly assault by a prisoner, and the second count would be aggravated assault. Both give rise to significant prison time. So how did Brianna get here? Well, in her past, she grew up in a family where her father regularly beat her mother in front of her and her siblings. And because of the family environment, she was transferred or put in the custody of her grandmother when she was 12 years old. She then began running away from home very shortly after that. And that began the start of her arrest record in Arizona. She repeatedly was arrested for things like running away, being an incorrigible child, and then for the probation violations that stemmed from these things. So the definition of incorrigible, that is incorrigible, incorrigible in Arizona, is a child who refuses to obey reasonable and proper orders from their parent, guardian, or custodian, and they're beyond the control of the parent, guardian, or custodian, or they're habitually truant. So just think about this for a minute, that this kind of conduct on the part of a 12-year-old is getting them engaged in the state criminal justice system. Okay, there's more to this story. So in April of 2016, when she was about 14 years old, she was bullied in her middle school and she ran away. And when she ran away, there was a man who he was in his 30s, and he came across her and he raped her. After that happened, she continued to be arrested for shoplifting, possession of drugs. She was diagnosed with a substance abuse disorder for meth, and also marijuana addiction. She was released from the facilities that she was in to attend her first day as a freshman in high school, and she ran away from school. Another man raped her after she ran away from school, and she was missing for 17 days during this occasion, and contacted her grandmother and was very upset. Her grandmother called the police, and the police ended up arresting her for violating probation by running away. So she ends up back in jail again. What keeps happening to her over and over again is that she keeps running away, so she keeps violating probation, so she keeps getting arrested, and she gets back in the system. Well, the next year, almost exactly a year later, April 2017, she runs away again. This time she's picked up by a man and two other men who are ultimately convicted of harming her. She was raped multiple times. Two of the men ended up getting prison time, one for 5 years, the other for 13 years. So it was a pretty serious, it's pretty serious what happened to her here. Throughout, multiple mental health assessments were done for Brianna, placements in treatment facilities, or facilities that said they had treatment. These facilities were scrutinized because her case is a well-known case in Arizona. Different organizations have looked at her story, and they found that those facilities didn't provide the right or any services in some cases for her trauma. So an expert on sexual trauma and juvenile justice has looked at her case, and I'm just going to read you a quote from this expert. She says, "In many ways, this case is an example of the system responding to a girl of color who has experienced trauma and responding by punishing her. When we punish these children the same way we punish adults, it is not accomplishing the goal of increasing public safety. Instead, it's depriving these girls of the very kinds of support and services that they need in order to heal and thrive and to be less likely to engage in the type of behavior that's being punished." And the article that we were looking at and that's cited on the PowerPoint quotes a 2015 multi-state study that found for girls, sexual abuse is one of the strongest predictors of whether a girl will be charged again. A trauma expert talked about how a traumatized kid's behavior is exactly correct biologically. He says after trauma, they may spend every day in what he calls Hulk mode, like the Incredible Hulk. Their system is so jacked up, and the real problem is that adults are not trained to recognize recognize Hulk mode or calm their bodies down. Instead, what adults try to do is to exercise control over them. We've designed institutions that keep saying the way to deal with a kid who is having a Hulk moment is to punish, shame, and try to control them. Okay, so Brianna's story gives us some interesting elements to think about when we're thinking about whether or not the tribal system and the laws in the tribal system work toward the purposes that we ascribe to them. So some of the problem areas in the old system is, number one, they were really designed to punish. And unfortunately, the kinds of conduct that we were punishing or maybe are punishing in some tribal codes, it's really symptoms of maltreatment or victimization, like running away, for example. Running away, in Brianna's case, was a symptom of the violence in her childhood home, and later her trauma from rape, multiple rapes. The second area where we can have problems is where we lump together our provisions that deal with child abuse or child maltreatment with provisions that deal with juvenile delinquency, which are really focused on the conduct of adolescents. Tribal codes that do this tend to not have the full array of provisions they need for the specific purposes, like using a dull knife as a tool to cut something that needs a sharp knife. So if the codes are lumped together in this way, you don't have your full array of tools, or you're mixing your tools for different purposes. The same thing happens where tribal codes lump juvenile delinquency process together with status offenses or truancy process. You know, are we really looking at criminal conduct? Are we looking at symptoms of something else that require therapeutic interventions? That was number 3. Number 4, are we essentially criminally prosecuting adolescents as adults? Do we just have a baby criminal justice system where we're fast tracking them to a guilty plea and a sentence and putting them in juvenile detention? If that's the effect of the way your tribal law operates, then it's punishment. It's a baby criminal justice system. And that doesn't work on adolescents to deter them. It certainly doesn't work on them therapeutically to help them get better. And so thus we have problems if that's what we're doing. The 5th problem area is where, and this is such a common difficult area in every system probably, is where we put children and adolescents in the juvenile justice system on probation. And we give them all these conditions for being on probation, like don't run away from home. And then, of course, they run away from home and they violate their condition of probation. And under many older tribal laws, that's a new crime or a new offense. And it just starts racking up the offenses in the juvenile justice system, and they keep coming back into the system. So if that's what's happening, either explicitly in the law or in application, then we've got a problem with the system. Number 6 really focuses on things that are outside of the statute for the most part, like, do our systems fail to identify problems and intervene early? Are we required to work with families and schools? Do we recognize that we have on-reservation homelessness? Maybe the kids aren't all living outside, but they're not in their homes. They're sort of living everywhere else. And if that's true, are we giving them a place, a respite or shelter care facility if they can't live at home? Maybe their home is a violent place. And I mean places that are not juvenile detention. I mean actually a real respite or shelter care facility with services. And then finally, do we provide diversion and community programs or services? So number 6 is all those other things that may be, for the most part, outside of the law or the court process, but you still need them to support the reforms in the law and the court process. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So I made a diagram just of what I think a more fulsome juvenile justice process would look like if you had all the bells and whistles and the really great budget. And also to point out that the juvenile justice system is more than just the court, right? You've got the schools, you've got law enforcement. If you have a teen court program that's outside of the court, then that's all part of your juvenile justice process. If you have referrals to other programs or diversions to other programs like circle process or peacemaking or mediation or conferencing like family group conferencing, that's part of your juvenile justice process. And then even within the court itself, you can have, in a sense, different courts. In the state system, they call these dockets. Like they'll have the children's docket that deals with child abuse, and all the child abuse cases are assigned to one judge. And then they'll have the juvenile court docket that deals with juvenile offenses, and all those cases are assigned to one judge. Many state court systems also have juvenile wellness courts and dockets that are therapeutic, that are separate from the other two. So kind of notice the different compartments here. I'm calling them dockets. You might call them something else. Children's court, juvenile court, wellness court. But notice that there are separate compartments.
Okay, folks, so we're just getting everybody back up here. And let me just do a quick check-in with Laura. Laura, did you need to convey any tech issues at this point?
Nothing to convey over here. Let me know once we're ready to launch into the polling, and I'll get that up.
Okay, great. Let's do that. So I'm your fearless instructor, Pat Sekaquaptewa, and what I'd like to do is invite you to answer a couple of poll questions. And all you have to do is click the boxes. So let's do poll number 1. Okay, so this poll is asking you, what is the primary goal of the juvenile justice system? Is it, and this is your idea of what the primary goal should be. Should it be to keep the public safe? Should it be to keep youth and their families healthy and unified? Should it be to keep youth safe from themselves and others? Should it be to hold youth accountable for their actions or omissions? Or should it be to provide a therapeutic or cultural intervention for youth? So you figure out what you think the primary goal is and click those buttons and submit. And I see the poll is in progress, that you're thinking about it.
Yep, lots of responses are coming in and still coming in, so we'll give it just a few more seconds.
Okay, great. And I know we're forcing you to pick one, which is really cool because you probably want to click all the buttons. Okay, so it looks like most people at 41% clicked to provide therapeutic and or cultural interventions. And the lowest one was to keep youth safe from themselves and others. Maybe the second highest one was to keep youth and their families healthy and unified. Okay, interesting. Tasha, does anything jump out at you from these poll results?
Definitely.
I think looking at the highest response rate, providing the therapeutic or cultural interventions, which is something you definitely stressed in the video, it really shows that shift in paradigm from the old school, strictly punitive way of looking at things, and coming into our own, and really, you know, we've talked about before that I feel like when we create our courts, it's an act of sovereignty. We can make them whatever we want them to be and whatever best serves our community. And I really appreciate that was the leading answer, because I think that's where a lot of our strengths reside, in the resilience of our people. So I really enjoyed that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tasha. And I also want to remind people that you can ask questions if you click on the question triangle in your control panel, and we can type answers to your questions. And you can also do that during the video. So please feel free to do that, or comment. That's good too. Tasha, did you want to say anything else before we move to the second poll?
No, I think yeah, let's go to the second poll. That may spur some more conversation.
Okay, great. Poll number 2. Okay, number 2. What is the most feasible approach for improvement in your system? You only get to pick one again. So, number 1, secure detention with provider trained in trauma care. So that means like a juvenile jail. The second one is supervised probation with a provider trained in trauma care. The third one is out-of-home placement with a provider trained in trauma care. The fourth is residential treatment with a provider trained in trauma care. And the last one is respite or shelter care with a provider trained in trauma care. So in your system, what is the most feasible approach for improvement? And go ahead and click a box.
Responses are still coming in, starting to slow down a little bit. So if you haven't participated yet, we invite you to do so now, and we'll close the poll in the next 10 seconds or so.
Okay, so you know what, Tasha, I'm going to let you lead off on this one.
Sure, not a problem. So it looks like the leading answer was supervised probation with provider trained in trauma care, and then closely followed by residential treatment with provider trained in trauma care, and respite shelter care with provider trained in trauma care. One thing that I find interesting is, and I'm glad that you did it this way, Pat, was to include trained in trauma care. You know, we have a lot of intergenerational and historic traumas within our communities, but we do have current traumas that we're facing as well. And so really training people to be able to work with our youth in the ways that they need to be worked with. And so as part of our center, we do provide trauma training through the National Native Children's Trauma Center. And I was sitting on a listening session earlier this week about reentry, and one of the gentlemen in his testimony talked about really making juvenile justice a profession, and really training people in what they're doing. You know, he talked about how people kind of fall into this or just come into it in a happenstance kind of way, but really training up and knowing how to do it. I think his examples were community police that are in the schools. They may be the gentleman or woman that's going to retire soon, and they just say, we'll put you at the school, but they're really not trained to deal directly with juveniles who experience trauma and all of those things. So I like that we're really indicating that there needs to be some training here and understanding.
Yes, thank you so much, Tasha. I agree. And I wonder if
we don't end up selecting probation and residential treatment to place the trauma care because that's what we typically have had. And I wonder if we don't need to think a little more out of the box and try to get some respite and shelter care facilities in most of our communities with the trauma care. I do appreciate that that's a budget issue, a big budget issue. But it's always good to, just reflect on the institutions we inherited and whether they need to be revamped or expanded or replaced.
Yeah, I think the respite shelter care, especially depending on how it's designed and implemented, would be also less traumatic to youth who are experiencing things that need, to have them away from the home. So if we make that more welcoming and home feeling facility, then it can definitely help youth to open up and feel better and be more receptive to what we're trying to provide as far as programming and healing.
Yeah, I think so too. And my experience, at least on my own home reservation, is that we just did not have a shelter at all. So there was no place for an overnight, multi-overnight place for youth to get services who were not living in their own home. So it may be they just don't exist in some places.
Right, and then I think in some of the places where they do exist, it's just like shelters anywhere else. There may not be enough beds, and how do we accommodate our need to its fullest extent? So there's a lot of planning and follow-up that has to happen if that's something we're going to implement in our community.
Good point. Okay, let's do the third poll. Here we go. So here's the third poll. Which are the top 3 most important or needed in your system? So you can select one or more, it says, but just pick 3. Now, the first one is a school assessment and disciplinary process. The second one is a teen court program. The third one is a wellness court that has therapeutic and cultural aspects. The fourth is a juvenile court that handles juvenile and status offenses. And the last one is a truancy court. So which are your top 3 that you need the most? And I know it's unfair to make you pick 3, but go ahead.
All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
And I'll hand it off to you, Tasha.
Sure. So as training and technical assistance providers for juvenile healing wellness courts, we definitely value that the wellness court therapeutic or cultural model came in, with the highest response rate. We've seen in our work with tribal grantees some really promising practices in the ways that people are incorporating culture and healing into those drug courts. So, we definitely find value in that. As for the school assessment and disciplinary process, for me, I feel like that one might need to be coupled or, have some collaboration with some of these other kinds of courts within our tribal judicial systems. Because what I found, I'm a military spouse and I have 2 daughters. We've moved around to different parts of the country. And so, as we all know, school systems are different in how they approach discipline. So my daughters were in a rural school in Oklahoma where they allowed paddling, and I had to sign a waiver saying I did not want my children to be paddled. And then most recently we lived in the Tacoma, Washington area, and that school was trauma-informed and really worked on restorative justice. And so those kinds of things can be all over the place. So I think with us, building and shaping our codes, that we have to take those things into consideration and come to agreements with those other outside parties, unless it's a tribal school that, is run by the tribe. And then another thing that we've seen is a ramp up in the teen court. Sometimes schools are incorporating those. And so again, if it could be in partnership with the tribe and local community or municipality and all work together, because I think, we all have the same goals. So I think those are really great. But as the question's worded, it's what's the most important and pressing need in your system. So all of these are completely valid in how you all are prioritizing this is, of course, what is most important to the community you're in or the community you serve. And I think sometimes just looking at it and ranking them can help us move forward in how we want to shape our codes and implement them once they're written.
Yeah, I agree. And ideally, you would have all of these in your system if you have the budget and the personnel for it, because there's multiple points at which you need to address many different people's needs. And so ideally, you'd have all of it. But assuming that you don't necessarily have all those resources, it's helpful to get a sense of where you should target your scarce resources.
Absolutely. And as we are all living through this global pandemic, there are other things that we've never had to deal with before and not really had to think about before. So one thing that has really been trending within all of the work that we do is truancy. And what does that look like in a digital era where people are going to school virtually? And so cyber truancy, and how are we addressing that as far as preventative measures, but also, if there are status offenses like that, then who's in charge of reporting that, and how do we monitor that?
Oh, good grief. That one sounds like a huge issue. I mean, it may be partly the parents, right? Who just can't handle keeping track of all that cyber school.
Yes, I'm definitely the cyber police in my home, so.
Okay, great. Thanks, folks. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you the second part of the pre-recorded lecture. So ask questions in the question box as we go, or just make comments. Let's hand it off to Laura to show us the second video.
So if you have an old system, it's going to look more punitive. It's also possible if you have not well fleshed out laws in your juvenile justice area, that the way that the court is run, even if it's not following specific legal provisions, it can still tend to be punitive or punishment oriented. And this may be because you inherited a more punitive system or a punishment oriented system from an era when the state systems were very punitive, like in the 1980s. It might be because you inherited a really old Code of Federal Regulations set of provisions. It also might just be human nature. So there are philosophical differences also in designing these systems. When you look at misconduct of youth, do you see a symptom of something wrong that can be cured? Or do you see the makings of a criminal and criminal activity? Because one view will lead you in one direction and the other view will lead you in another. So it's important to look at how punitive your provisions are. It'll give you a sense of what you need to talk about with your court development teams about whether you mean for your system to be so punitive. Some of the symptoms of a punitive system are that youth are fast-tracked in the tribal court process to either admit that they've done something that would be an offense, either status offense or juvenile offense in the system, without any actual trial kind of process. Or most of your cases are guilty pleas where they just all plead guilty and then they get sentenced to detention. If there's a lot of that fast tracking going on, you've got a punitive system, at least in effect, and probably also in the way that the legal provisions are written up. You should look at whether or not status offenses like running away are fast tracking people into detention. Or whether it's more like juvenile offenses, things that could be crimes if they were an adult. Status offenses should not be fast-tracking youth into detention. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the second problem area is keeping your laws lumped together, particularly lumping your child maltreatment laws, your children's court, with your juvenile delinquency laws, which would be your juvenile court. And the reason you don't want to lump them together is because they have different purposes. Children's court is focused on the parents' conduct. Are they abusing their kids? Are they maltreating their kids? Juvenile court is focused on the conduct of adolescents for the most part, and looking at whether they've committed offenses, or whether they've committed status offenses and they need some interventions. And so if you're using the same lumped provisions to handle both of these purposes, then you have less precise tools in your work. Also, I tend, when I see a tribal court that's doing this, often they don't have both sets of provisions. You're using a fork for a knife or a knife for a fork, and the purposes are all scrambled. So it's a coherence issue, a purpose and using the right tool kind of issue here. Okay, let's look at the next one. So there's another lumping that goes on where the juvenile laws will lump together juvenile delinquency or juvenile offenses with status offenses and truancy process. And they're all in the same law, or maybe you don't have all three parts and you're using, again, a knife for a fork and a fork for a knife, or a spoon for a knife. And so you want to go back in and see what's really going on. The really great thing about the 2016 Model Juvenile Code is that it has it has the knife, the fork, and the spoon. And so you can go back in and look at the legal provisions for each category, delinquent acts, status offenses, and truancy, and there's a separate part of the code for each of those. Okay, so if we look at our little table here, there are some differences between juvenile offenses and status offenses. Now, I just want to key you into the language here. Under the model juvenile codes, whether you're looking at the one from 1989 or the one from 2016, they use some fancy language for status offenses. They call that process fins or chins, or family in need of services, or children in need of services. That's code for provisions in the law that deal with status offenses. Things like not going to school, like a breakdown in the parent-child relationship, like that incorrigible thing, or runaways. And in this fins, chins, status offense category, kids don't go to detention. Court orders don't last very long. Shelter care is preferred over any kind of jail-like kind of environment. Lots of services are provided. There are things that judges can't do, like they can't throw someone in jail until they're 18, for example, or in a juvenile detention facility. Okay, so we don't want all of these things lumped together in one set of code provisions. Ideally, there's a parallel set of provisions, one that deals with juvenile offenses, they're kind of like crimes, and one that deals with status offenses, and the magic language can be fins or chins or something like that. And in the model juvenile code from 2016, they use the CHINS, C-I-N-S. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So I was trying to find a way visually to distinguish between what the old tribal codes are doing, what the model codes are doing. I think lawyers tend to think of these questions as jurisdiction questions. Or who does the court have power over in these different kinds of code clusters? And in the juvenile courts, of course, they're directed by the laws to know who tribal council has given them power over. So in a lot of old tribal codes, they define what they call status offenses. They don't say fins, they don't say chins, they just say status offenses. And often they're lumped right in there with juvenile offenses. And we'll look at some of them in a minute. But I wanted to show you what these categories look like in the model juvenile codes. So there's two model juvenile codes. One is called the National Indian Justice Center's Tribal Juvenile Code from 1989. And the other is called the Model Indian Juvenile Code of 2016. This is the BIA code that you're seeing circulating right now. And you'll notice that both of those split the law provisions into two sections. So you have juvenile offenders provisions, and then you have family in need of services if you're looking at that old 1989 code, or they call it children in need of services in the purple on the right if you're looking at the 2016 code. And the legal provisions, you know, there's even different court process for those two different categories. Okay, so let's look at the juvenile offender provisions. So these are the kinds of things that would be crimes if youth were adults in the criminal justice system. So, for example, the 1989 code talks about juvenile offenses, a criminal violation of the tribe's law and order code committed by a person under 18. So it's basically a crime by someone under 18. And then go to the right of that, you'll see the Model Indian Juvenile Code provision. They don't call it a juvenile offense, they call it a delinquent act. And this is an act that is committed by a child that would be a criminal violation of the tribal code if committed by an adult, and then a child is defined to be under 18 years of age. So language is a little bit different, but it's the same idea. A child commits something that would have been a crime if they were an adult, and then a child is under 18. Okay, let's go to the bottom then. That other category of status offenses that the 1989 code calls them family in need of services, and the 2016 code calls it child in need of services. Family in need of services is where a child is absent from school, or there's a breakdown in the parent-child relationship. So it's really focusing not so much on the conduct of the child as the situation of the family. And if you look at the 2016 code, they're looking at a child who habitually engages in conduct like being disobedient that poses a substantial risk to someone, or where they're a runaway, or where they engage in conduct prohibited by the tribal code that applies only to children. So there's more categories in the 2016 code for child in need of services. Thing that you need to know is that these are refinements on status offenses, and well, maybe they're evolutions of status offenses to incorporate more of what is going on in the family and less focusing sort of like on the what has the child done wrong. And then, of course, the court, when it finds that this situation exists, is going to have more services for the family and the child. Okay, so let's go back and look at those old tribal codes. Go down one slide. So look at these provisions, one set from Blackfeet, one set from Leech Lake. So things like violating curfew, that's a status offense. Now they're saying that these are status offenses in their tribal laws, but typically these are not all status offenses if you compared jurisdictions across the states and across the tribes. So, for example, if you look at Leech Lake, possession and consumption of a controlled substance, that would be a crime in many places. And therefore, if it's undertaken by someone under the age of 18, then it is a juvenile offense or a delinquent act. It's not a status offense. So these tribes are kind of lumping everything together. Things that would have been crimes in the criminal code, juvenile offenses, status offenses, truancy, and they add some other things too. So let's think about what things would qualify as a status offense, because it's going to be treated differently in the model codes depending on whether it's a status offense, a FINS or a CHINS, or whether it's a juvenile offense. Okay, so I'm probably babbling now and your eyeballs have rolled into the back of your head, so let's try this another way. Go down to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk about court process here a bit and use some visuals. So this is the bad example. This is the outdated tribal court process. Here's how this story goes. Someone says that the young person has done something criminal, otherwise known as a juvenile offense or a delinquent act. A criminal complaint is filed against that young person in tribal court. There's a hearing at which that young person is asked by the judge to admit the thing they did wrong and or to plead guilty. There's no trial ever because the young person pleads guilty or they admit to something that causes them to plead guilty right before the judge. So there's never any proof that they did it, no trial court process. And then another sentencing hearing is set, and they are sentenced, either they are sentenced to detention and or they're put on probation with lots of conditions, like you can't hang out with, people who are drinking. There's like 20 conditions on the average order here. So what happens? They may be released. The kid can't comply with all of those things on the list, and so they violate their probation. And under many of those old tribal codes, that's a new criminal offense, and they go right back around again through this diagram. They go back to court and it all happens again, and now they're just stacking up detention time and probation time and going round and round. So that's the outdated system. Okay, go to the next slide. So this system is from the Model Indian Juvenile Code of 2016. This is for delinquency. So this is where it's an adolescent under the age of 18, but it's the juvenile offense or delinquent act process. It's not the status offense FINS CHINS process. So in this process, the young person is alleged to have committed a delinquent act. These are things that would have been crimes if they were adults, like possessing a controlled substance or consuming a controlled substance, meth. We'll just call it meth for now. So in this process, you can see they don't immediately go into court hearings. Instead, there's a juvenile case coordinator who's going to investigate the situation, meet with them and their families, put together a plan to intervene to help that young person. And if that's successful, that's the end of it. If it's unsuccessful, then it starts to go into court process where a petition is filed in court. There's an initial hearing here, and rather than being pushed to plead guilty, there are potential motions to take that case out of court. Maybe they get sent to wellness court docket. Maybe they go to circle process. There's a second doorway here to move that case out of the court system. Now, if none of that works, it will go to trial, or what we call adjudication in juvenile court, and then things can be proved or not proved. If that young person is found to have committed the delinquent act, then there's a disposition hearing and an order. But notice, even at that point, that young person can be ordered to special programs like wellness court at this point, even at the very end. And so these big blue bubbles on the diagram are doorways to other processes that don't just keep sending that young person down the road to detention. Okay, let's look at another one. Go to the next slide. So this one should read child in need of services. So now we're in a status offense category. Chin-spin status offense. This is a different kind of court process under the 2016 code. Notice the very first thing it says. It doesn't say alleged to have committed a delinquent act or a crime. It says somebody is requesting services. And then it goes to the juvenile case coordinator, who works with the family and the person who requested services and the youth. And there's all kinds of planning for services for the family. And it can all end there. If it doesn't, it can go into court as a child in need of services petition so that you can get a judge to order things. And again, you have these blue bubbles where the whole thing can kind of be diverted out to another process or a program. And if it's successful, that's the end of it. If it's not, it can go back to court and the judge can stay in charge of this family. But yet still the judge is going to be able to order other services and programs. So something that should be jumping out at you is that you can have all this beautiful legal process, but if you don't have the programs and services, it means nothing. So we can help you reform your legal structure and process, but you still have to pull in the funding and develop with the community all those programs and services like a wellness court or circle process or something traditional or cultural, whatever it is, and all the treatment programs. They've got to be there. Okay, the 2016 model code also has a chapter on truancy. So you just by looking at it, you can already tell that that court process is different and that all these preliminary things happen. Like, for example, there's a tribal truancy board in here that is part of the process that you don't see in those other diagrams. So take a good hard look at that Model Indian Juvenile Code. If you're looking at dealing with truancy specifically, it has its own internal process. I mean, separate from delinquent acts and separate from chin-spins. All right, let's go to the next slide. So you know you have a problem with your system if you're exclusively criminally prosecuting adolescents as adults. There are a lot of ways to do this. One of the early ways was to put a piece of law in your juvenile law that let you transfer cases out of juvenile court into adult criminal court. Those are disfavored, and other laws have now come about that circumvent that process anyway, where prosecutors are given discretion to charge someone as an adult right off the bat. And there's a lot of controversy around that. But you know you have a problem if you're in your system, if it looks like this is what you're doing, whether it's in the legal wording or whether it's just in the way your judge applies the law in actual cases. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Put them on probation. So if you're putting them on probation and a violation of the condition of probation is a new crime, then you are just, you're creating over and over again a process that criminalizes the behavior and conduct and symptoms of a young person in your juvenile justice system. So this is a problem. If you're seeing this, then we need to take a hard look at your system. Okay, and then the other failures we talked about, identifying problems. If you're not doing these things, if you're not identifying problems and intervening early, now if you're following the model code, you've got all that process going on where someone is intervening early. Are you working with family and schools? Again, if you're using the model code provisions, you have to do this. It's going to drive you to work with families and schools. What about our recognizing on-reservation homelessness, or having respite or shelter care for people who can't live at home? Do you have the diversion and community programs and services? I think we've talked about this already. So these are necessary adjuncts to your court process. Okay, so what are the lessons learned? And I've probably now said this over and over again. Don't punish people in your system for symptoms. Separate your child maltreatment law and process from your juvenile delinquency laws and process. Separate your juvenile delinquency laws and process from your status offense process, the fins-chins process. Also, you want to separate out your truancy laws and process. There may be a reason to prosecute an adolescent in the criminal system. It's disfavored, but there may be a reason to do it, and you may have other legal provisions that provide for prosecutors to do that in your tribal system. Do not put children and adolescents on probation with conditions where a violation of the conditions is a new crime. You're just churning those kids into your system. You're turning them into juvenile offenders, and also maybe even criminals, because you're acclimating them to your criminal system. You're mixing them with people in that system over and over again. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Oh, that may be the last one. Okay, so those are our lessons learned for today. I know this was a lot of legalese, and I hope that the examples were helpful. Okay, thank you.
Hello again. Okay, let's get everybody back up. Here we go.
Hi, I'm back. So I really like, Pat, how you use analogies and things like that. It really speaks to how I understand life. So when you're talking a lot about tools and utensils, it helps me to visualize and conceptualize what you're talking about in a very different way. So I was thinking, wow, within our tribal judicial systems, we need to be like sports, like the half fork, half spoon, or like a Swiss Army knife, right? We have to be all the tools and be ready to pull those out at any moment, any given situation, which is overwhelming. But I think, again, it speaks to our resilience and our ability to adapt and do what we have to do to support our communities. But that was just a random thought that I had. Like, man, we have to be Swiss Army knives. We can't just be the fork or the knife. And then when you were talking about status offenses, I also thought again and brought it back to where we are currently, and if we create provisions or emergency provisions in our codes for times like this, I mean, who would have thought we'd be in a pandemic? But with new curfew laws and ordinances and emergency orders, are we seeing an uptick in our children having contact with the juvenile justice system because they're not used to these curfews, or they're not really happy being locked down, or they've cordoned off the basketball court for social distancing, but kids still want to play sports? And so what are these things doing as far as driving incidents of touching the justice system, and maybe with children who wouldn't have touched it before?
Yeah, I could see an increase in opportunities for the juvenile justice system to touch their lives where it might not have otherwise. So it's really great if you have that CHINS process, that child in need of services process, because remember, it's not stigmatizing kids as being juvenile offenders. They're never alleged to have committed a juvenile offense. Instead, someone is requesting services by a juvenile counselor, and that person just works with the family and they resolve it, and it never touches the system in a way it would if you were under the juvenile offense provision. So if you have that separation in your law and in your system, you can protect all those kids from not touching the system, who would not have otherwise been in it.
Yeah, and I really like the way, and when we were looking at one of the visuals, that you described it, doorways to other processes. And so again, in my mind, the way that my mind works, I'm thinking, you know, instead of putting them in a maze that has no end and we keep running into these walls as we try to get out of this, or playing chutes and ladders where we hit a chute and we go right back to square one, that we really are talking about designing our juvenile codes as a journey and a pathway for them to get beyond whatever it is that has brought them to this place. And so I really like that you said that these were doorways to other processes, because I think those small shifts when we're drafting codes or ordinances in how we think about things can have, of course, long-lasting impact well into the future. So I appreciate how you worded that.
Yeah, thank you, Tasha. And were there any other questions that people were asking that jumped out at you?
I know that someone did ask to see where they could get the model code. I posted that in the chat, so if anyone, and this is the 2016 revision that's in there, and of course they'll have all of our contact information. If they have follow-up questions, you are all welcome to still continue to chat in. And then I just had one more thing that I wanted to ask you about before we jump into the next set of polls. You talked about failure to intervene early. And as I said earlier this week, I was on a listening session having to do with reentry. And one thing they talked about specifically with truancy was that, and this was a municipality, that within their municipality, they saw school children who had really truant behavior, if you can, when you're a kindergartner, but in kindergarten. And they tracked that. And so what they found out is, yes, we should have really looked at these kids who are already missing school at high rates in kindergarten, rather than waiting till junior high and high school, where it became a bigger issue, where they did touch the justice system. So really starting out, to me, very early. But I think it kind of speaks to what you're talking about. Do you think that's too early, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, and that's part of the reason why they separated out the truancy court provisions into its own little package, so that more attention could be paid to exactly that kind of thing. I don't know, I'd have to look at the age ranges in the model code, but I have no doubt that it would suggest that we start as early as possible. You're training the parents in kindergarten as well as the kids.
Right, absolutely. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and jump into the polls now. Laura, if you want to pull up the first poll.
We did, before we start, one question just came through. If I could share that. Greece just asked, do you have any suggestions, or does the model have suggestions for how to implement the services in phases? It sounds like there needs to be a lot of programs in place before implementing the whole system, and that's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, there is a provision where that it might be the juvenile counselor. I'd have to get the exact name for you, but there is a provision in that code where they manage a registry of all existing services and programs. So it's more of a networking and cataloging and updating of services that are available, because not all of those programs are under the court in every tribe. You know, they're often outrun by other people and programs. And so it's a networking mandate under the code for the court and the court staff.
Right, and for those participants on the call that either are funded through Purpose Area 8 or 9, or have been funded similarly where it was recommended or required that you have a community advisory board or a stakeholder board, something like that. I think those are really helpful in maintaining those connections and that collaboration. But I would agree that it does, I mean, it definitely does take a village to get these things up and running, and a commitment. I think the further commitment that we all know that is really important is by tribal leadership, is really supporting what we're seeking to do as far as actually implementing, but outcomes as well.
And I should say that a court could build programs inside of the court as well. Some tribal courts have built programs, both therapeutic and wellness court and cultural programs inside the court system. That does happen. But also you want all the programs you can get your hands on outside of the court as well.
And just to share, Carol had shared, I highly recommend looking at the American Bar Association Family Court and Model Codes and Project 1 of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
All right, I'll pull up the next poll.
Okay, so this is poll number 4. Where would you change or put culture into your system? Select one or more of the following. So the first one is in the purpose section of your youth laws. The second one is to establish an elders or culture bearer board or body in your law. The third one is to establish a culturally tailored wellness court. The fourth is laws to require diversions from court to cultural activities. And the last one is laws to require diversions from court to cultural bodies. And you can select as many as you like here. So where in your system would you change or put culture into your laws?
And still a steady stream of responses coming in, so we'll leave it open for just another 15 seconds or so. Thanks everyone for participating.
All right. Are you pulling up the results now, Laura? Okay. So I think the results of this one are, kind of segue from some of the last questions with the establishment of culturally tailored wellness court. Again, that's work we do here at our PA center, and we're really focused on incorporating culture wherever possible. Some challenges that we've seen with that are that, tribes, by no fault of our own, we're all at different levels of cultural understanding and traditional knowledge. But we have seen where we can use some pan-Indian concepts, work with other local tribes regionally to regain some of our knowledge and to incorporate those in meaningful ways in the ways that those courts work. And then next we have in the purpose section of the youth laws. So I sometimes help tribes, aside from my work, independently in code drafting and policy drafting. And I think those purpose sections are extremely important, setting a foundation and a stage and a mutual understanding about why we're doing what we're doing, what's driving us, what are our guiding principles. And so I think those are super important as well. And then the diversion to court, from court to cultural activities, there is a woman who's very amazing at youth engagement, and she works in the prevention field, but she tells a story of a young man who came to one of her culture classes, and she was like welcoming him, and he was like, my mom made me come, and he didn't, he was not into it. And he came to a couple of her classes. It was like a drum making class, and his school reached out to her and saw that they saw a dramatic change in his behavior patterns and all of those things, and it was from just going into these cultural activities. So we know that those kinds of things work for our children. And she's now said, like, he's a junior in college. He's very culturally proud, whereas he wasn't before, proud of his culture, proud to be Indian. And he's learned a lot and presents nationally and things like that. So, one success story, but there are all of these children in all of our communities who could benefit from moving from that and working more diversion based. So I don't know, Pat, if you wanted to touch on any of the other responses. I think these responses are all pretty much even, the remainder.
So if you hadn't noticed, all of these it's kind of instructive to see that these are the ways that it gets put in the law. If you want to have a cultural purpose or priority, you put it in the purpose section. If you want to create new culture bodies, you have to establish them under the law, and those are the establishment provisions. If you want diversion provisions, those need to be in your juvenile code, so you have a doorway out of juvenile court into these other places. So those are the three main things, the ways you see culture incorporated: purpose section, establishment provisions, and diversion doors. And of course, there's much more creativity you could have here. Okay, so I think maybe we go to the next poll. All right, so number 5, which is not a purpose of a juvenile court proceeding? So select only one here. So is it not a purpose to secure the welfare of the youth? Is it not a purpose to preserve family unity? Is it not a purpose to distinguish juvenile offenses from status offenses? Is it not a purpose to determine whether a parent has maltreated their child? Or finally, is it not a purpose to provide supervision, treatment, and rehabilitation? So go ahead and answer the question. Okay, so this one, I think we may have missed one of our poll answers on this one. So all of these are purposes. Oh no, you're right. I take that back. We put it in there. So the correct answer was, it's not a purpose of your juvenile court to determine whether a parent has maltreated a child. So that was the correct answer. And why is that, Tasha?
I think it goes back to what you were talking about as far as lumping everything together. I mean, we may see that in what we're doing in proceedings in juvenile court, but that isn't the purpose. And those things would need to be referred out or reported if there's mandatory reporting to another purpose area of the court system.
Right. So a lot of folks put that in their children's court process, whether a parent has maltreated a child.
Right. And I think, if people, I think sometimes parents think that they too are on trial or being judged in that way. And so if we really want parent involvement and engagement, we need to make that clear that this is this and this is that, and there is a separation. And while they might exist at, simultaneously, that this is what we're dealing with here.
That's correct. Laura, do we have any other questions from folks online?
I haven't seen any others come in.
Okay, great.
Double check, but yeah.
Right, let's do the next poll, which I think is the last one, right?
Yep, this is the last poll.
Great. Number 6. Who is the target audience for status offense court process? Remember, this is chins and fins. Select one of the following: youth that are habitually disobedient of parental commands, youth who pose a substantial risk to himself or others, himself or herself, youth who run away, youth who engage other youth in other youth prohibited conduct under the law, or all of the above. So you're picking one of the following here.
Right, if you haven't voted, it's not too late. Leave it open for just a few more seconds.
Okay, I'll hand this off to you, Tasha. Oh, I guess maybe I should say this one had a right answer. It was all of the above.
Right. So looking at this, the target audience for status offenses, as Pat said, in the court process are all of these things. I think we'll see a different mixture of these things depending on what our community looks like and what our community's needs and challenges are. And that may be why we got some answers for the other ones, because those are the most pressing issues that you're facing in your community and areas of need. But generally, these are all applicable as far as being the target audience. And then, of course, I think the other target audience as far as outcomes, right, beyond the individual youth and their families are greater communities, our tribal nations, and then the communities that we interact with, because if we're looking at, healing and redirecting our youth, then that will have that ripple effect to every aspect of their life and all of the other areas and communities that they touch as they move forward into the future. So I don't know if you had anything else to add to that, Pat.
No, well, I guess I would just add that these answers actually are taken out of the 2016 Model Juvenile Code. So I just went to their provision for what is a child in need of services, and I listed them here, and then put all of the above on the bottom. So this is what you're looking at for a status offense under the Model 2016 Code.
Awesome. I think we can go to the slide now, Laura. Are you able to pull it up?
Yep, I'm getting it up now. Just a moment.
No worries.
I guess while she's pulling that up, or it might just pop up, there it is. All right, hand it back to Tasha.
Thank you, Laura. So you should have all of the resource sheets in the PowerPoint for today's session. We will be doing more sessions. It is a series. We, of course, are always a resource at the Tribal Youth Resource Center. Like I said, we provide training and technical assistance there. And then our parent organization is the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, which has a plethora of resources as well. So those are the websites for that. And next slide, Laura. So again, we do want to thank each of you for your presence today. I'm going to go ahead and close us out with a prayer. Also, you will get a link for evaluation. We would appreciate if you would fill that out. It'll just help us to improve as we move forward through this series. So I'll go ahead and end us in prayer if you'll bear with me. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Have a wonderful weekend.